The beautiful green grass and blue sky make it really hard to think back on some of the freeze damage we've had during this spring. But you look at some landscape plants like this lilac and it's pretty obvious that our weather patterns had some really negative impacts on some of our plants. The interesting thing about this damage is depending on the condition of the plant, whether it was newly established, whether we have a lot of lush foliage, whether the buds had already broken, and as importantly, where it was located on the property, are going to make a big difference in how much damage there was. For example, this particular lilac looks as though it's lost all its foliage and all its flowers. The ones right next to it and behind it have slightly less damage, or in some instances, very little damage that is visible. A part of that has to do, as I said, with how far extended the foliage was and the flowers were, but it also has to do with where the cold air settled during that last freeze period. As the wind moves through the landscape, cold air is heavier and it settles and sinks into low pockets. So one thing that people might notice is in the lowest, maybe the darkest, the dampest, least protected spots in their landscape, they're going to see more damage on their landscape plants. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a few of our plants as they progress over the summer and see how they recover from that particular damage if we manage them properly. And that management includes a couple of really key things. Don't prune off this damaged foliage just yet. Let's just wait and see what happens with these plants. Don't push them with fertilizer, but do keep them in good, healthy condition. Some of our most popular landscape trees that bloom in the spring are also showing various degrees of damage. The pears had already been in full bloom and they really lost their flowers. Redbuds, the same thing, and certainly the magnolias. But some of the crabapples are showing various degrees of damage, and again, it has to do with how far extended those buds were. We have some curled, sort of blasted foliage on this crabapple, but if you look at the buds, they were tight in bloom, and that meant that they were protected from that cold weather blast. They're just beginning to open now, and you might see a little bit of damage on some of the petals, but chances are this particular crabapple is going to show pretty much to advantage this year. That's something to keep in mind also as you're choosing landscape plants. Make sure that you're choosing selections that are going to bloom late enough in the season that they really might miss the majority of those late spring or late winter blasts. One of the other things you might notice is some of your overstory trees, oaks and lindens in particular, and even the ash, look almost as though they're dead right now. Well, they're not dead, they just break dormancy later. And that is one of the mechanisms those trees actually use to protect themselves from exactly these kinds of weather conditions. You're also going to see that in a lot of our native species and selections of native species. They know what the weather in the plains can be, and they're going to sort of think twice before they decide to break dormancy too early in the season. The earliest blooming trees, such as our magnolias, are really showing the absolute worst of the damage. This is a really good example. They were in full bloom when the freeze hit, and what you're looking at is essentially the sad remains of all of those beautiful pink flowers. Unfortunately, they also had started to push some of their foliage, and you can see that this leaf was originally a dark, beautiful green, and now it's this sort of shriveled up dead thing. What we have to hope is that plants with this sort of damage are going to break their secondary buds, which are latent buds under the bark, and that they will eventually refoliate. People ask whether we're going to get rebloom. We're not going to get rebloom, and we really don't want these plants to rebloom. The same sort of damage showed up on a lot of our maples, including the maples such as amber maple that are a little bit hardier. Japanese maple looks terrible, and a part of the reason for that is the maples, again, are very, very early blooming species. You want to make sure that you keep these plants as stress-free as possible during the growing season. Again, don't do any pruning right now. Don't push them with fertilizer. Do make sure that they are well mulched and well watered, but not overwatered, especially as we go into a drought situation. And we'll come back in future months and take a look at how these plants have recovered from this devastating freeze.